Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Environment and Planning Committee. I declare the meeting open at 7:01 p.m. Acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of all lands, water and sky in the Georgia River area. I pay my respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who live, work and meet on these lands. Apologies. No apologies tonight. And there's been no request to attend the meeting via audio-visual link. Notice of live streaming of committee meeting. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is being recorded for minute-taking purposes and is also being broadcast live to the public on Council's website. In accordance with Section 5 of Council's Code of Meeting Practice, the recording will be made available on Council's website. Code of Meeting Practice, the order of business is as shown in the agenda, which has been made available. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is open. Doors to the meeting room are to be left open unless the meeting moves into a closed confidential session, according to Section 14 of the Code of Meeting Practice. Only if the meeting moves into a closed confidential session will the public broadcasting of the meeting be suspended. Council's Code of Meeting Practice prohibits the electronic recording of meetings without the express permission of Council. Mobile phones must be turned to silent during the meeting. Disclosure of interest. Do any councillors have any interest to declare? Okay, there's no disclosure of interest. And our public forum tonight, we have one public speaker, Mr. Adrian Polhill, who's speaking on ENV 04624 annual update, progress towards net zero carbon emissions target. Mr. Polhill, you have 3 minutes. Would you go ahead, please?
Thanks, Peter. I want to first of all say thank you to the David and Andrew's team, at least, for the quite detailed report you put together on net zero emissions. I applaud your efforts to your effort to defer the carbon offsets decision until December 25, and also the effort to transition assets from gas to electricity. I think it's a terrific objective. I think there's a few questions and a few comments I have in terms of what things could be done to improve maybe the transparency of the net zero emissions and maybe some ways to indeed reduce them further. Have you considered introducing FOGO earlier than the New South Wales government is going to mandate it as 2030? There's significant carbon emissions from FOGO, and I think that may indeed bring some benefit to the council and both the council and the community. I have a question I've already asked Andrew before the meeting regarding the supply of waste services, and in clause 49, part number 3, it says the net zero target includes 3 other indirect emissions from activities not directly controlled by the council, such as supplier emissions. So I just ask you, and at least already said to me, currently the waste services emissions are not included. I find that I would like you to revisit that and actually challenge yourself as to why they're not included, because in clause 49, unless I've misread it, it does say that it does cover supplier emissions. Okay. These are real emissions in terms of waste and the methane generated, etc., and they do need to be reduced. Another point on the fleet transmission, the transition plan of the fleet. I have a question. Does that also include the waste vehicles moving from petrol or diesel-driven garbage vehicles to electric? Another point is regarding carbon offsets. You've said in the report the carbon offsets are incredibly risky, and I think you've used the words high risk. I'd actually also support that. I have attended a very interesting presentation by Professor Andrew McIntosh, and for those who don't know him, he's the ex-head of the Carbon Credit Integrity Assurance Scheme that was put together for Australia. And he has said that carbon credits are a sham, a fraud on taxpayers and the environment. It's quite serious. There's no clock, Peter, so I'm not sure. Okay. Yep. Okay. So I just urge the council to really think very carefully about abrogating your responsibility to somebody else by buying these carbon offsets and then saying to somebody else, you draw down the carbon, we'll continue to pollute. I think it's really quite a serious matter.
Okay, thanks, Adrian.
Oh, there's no clock, Peter. Sorry.
It's been
Oh,
told.
sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. I did have a couple of other comments.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
All right.
Okay. We move to the next item, which is confirmation of minutes of previous meeting. ENV 04524 confirmation minutes of the Environment and Planning meeting held on 11th of November 2024. Okay. Can I get a mover and a seconder, please? Okay. Okay. Moved by Councillor Andrew, seconded by Councillor Jamieson. All those in favour? Okay. I declare that carried. Thank you. Anybody against? Okay. Thanks. Okay, we move to our committee reports. The first one is ENV 04624, annual update, progress towards net carbon zero, a carbon emissions target. And before we call for a mover and seconder, I'll ask Ms. Ballasty, who's Manager Environment, Health and Regulatory Services, to give a report on that. Thanks.
Through the chair, good evening. I'll start by giving an update of the update and introduction of the report, and then address the speakers' questions and comments. This is an annual report. It's provided once a year. Each time it's provided, it does give an update on Council's progress towards its net zero carbon emissions produced in Council's operations by the year 2025 target. The figures in this report are provided for the financial year 23-24. In the financial year 23-24, Council continued to work towards its net zero carbon emissions target. There was a approximate 1% increase in Council's carbon emissions through its operations since the year prior, so that's the financial year 23-24. However, there has been a 78% decrease in Council's overall carbon emissions since the baseline year and since reporting commenced against this net zero carbon emissions target. So that is a considerable improvement and reduction in Council's emissions. The primary areas of Council's emissions remain with fleet, so Council's operational fleet, which is approximately 35% of our emissions profile, followed by gas, which is approximately 24% of our emissions profile. As I mentioned, the net zero carbon emissions target year is 2025. During the current financial year, so 24-25, Council did commit a $50,000 through a successful budget bid to enable the independent review and verification of Council's emissions profile. That's recommended to be done before Council procure or consider procuring any carbon offsets, to ensure that our emissions profile has been independently reviewed, verified before we go down the certification pathway. There is some information contained in the report, and as the speaker did indicate, the recommendation of the report is that the purchase of offsets continue to be deferred until that independent verification and assessment is completed. That's expected to be completed by June 2025, with a further report to Council expected by December 2025. We're expecting that report will provide the verified carbon emissions, as well as also some more firm and concrete information regarding the cost to offset, be it through national offsets or international offsets. To just address some of the speakers' comments and questions there. The first question was regarding FOGO implementation earlier than the 2030 mandate. As part of Council's waste collection contract, which has commenced this current financial year, Council did adopt that collection contract, which did allow for FOGO to be implemented in 2030. So Council has already committed to that mandate year. There are provisions within the waste collection contract for Council to consider a trial of FOGO prior to the year 2030. However, I will remind Council that the reason Council has committed to the year 2030 is to align with a vehicle changeover of the waste collection fleet at 6 years being 2030, and that would then align with the implementation of a FOGO service. The second question was regarding emissions as a result of the waste collection service. And Adrian did point out clause 49, which refers to 3 scopes. So scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 carbon emissions, which would typically be reported prior to the purchase of any carbon offsets. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Council is currently undertaking a review, an independent review and verification of its emissions profile, and that will include being advised by an independent consultant regarding scope 3 emissions. I will remind you that Council's target is net zero carbon emissions within its operations, so that's within its direct control, and that typically relates to scope 1 and scope 2, not scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions refers to emissions that are produced by Council suppliers, and that would be all suppliers to Council, not just the waste collection contractor, and emissions that are produced as a result of the waste collection contract, which is outsourced. The third question was regarding the moving away from petrol and conventional vehicles to electric vehicles, again under the waste collection contract. So Council did around this time last year support the waste collection contract, which did not cater for any electric vehicles. The reason being that when Council went to tender prior to that contract execution, the market did not, so waste contractors did not offer Council an alternative solution to conventional petrol vehicles. The reason for that, the waste industry told us that electric vehicles are not fit for purpose, and they're not able to undertake the nature and the volume of collections that would be undertaken on a day-to-day basis in Georges River. And the fourth comment was regarding climate change as a high risk to Council. So that is correct. The risk implication section of the report does refer to climate change being considered as one of Council's greatest risks and greatest risks to the community. And Adrian did also mention some research that had been done and reference made to carbon credits being a sham and a fraud on the environment. So that is one view, but as you'll see, as per the recommendation of this report, we are recommending to defer the purchase of carbon offsets. And the work that Council has done to date, year on year, since its net zero emissions target was made, has been to reduce its emissions. So that's been the number one priority, is to reduce our emissions. And then if Council were to consider and resolve to go ahead and then purchase carbon offsets, We've really practiced what we've preached, and we've done all that we can to reduce our emissions up front, thereby reducing the risk and also the cost to council in purchasing any offsets. I hope that addresses the questions so far. Adrian, are there any questions at all so far?
Can I get a mover and a seconder before we have any debate? Thank you.
Okay, moved by Councillor Ellison, seconded by
I've got no one.
Councillor Lansbury.
No, me.
Councillor Jamison.
He thinks it's you.
Okay, is there any discussion or questions from the councillors
I've got a couple of questions. That's all right.
for the director?
Just when you said fleet is 35%, how much of that is actually our waste garbage trucks? That's a bit of hard.
Zero. So the 35% makes up council's operational fleet. So they're the emissions within our direct control. So they're the emissions that come from operational fleet owned and managed directly by council. So leaseback vehicles, pool cars, as well as operational vehicles, street sweeping, but not emissions from the waste collection service.
So is the waste collection under waste, is it? Or
it would be the waste or street sweeping services provided by assets and infrastructure. So those emissions from council owned vehicles are included in that 35%.
Okay.
But any emissions from vehicles owned by Veolia, so undertaking domestic and garbage bin collection services, bulky waste and illegally dumped waste services, those are not included. Those would be considered scope 3 emissions and not directly included within this report.
okay. And then I noticed you've got solar panels. Do they have batteries? Do we connect to batteries or are we thinking?
No, there are currently no batteries in use. The reason being that typically and up until this point, the payback period for the purchase of batteries has not been conducive or not warranted the purchase of those at the time. The other significant thing that has happened in the last 12 months is that council has achieved its 100% renewable energy target a couple of years early. So by procuring 100% renewable energy from the grid, council is reducing its need to use its own renewable energy as we're purchasing that already from the grid as well.
And then we talked about gas. Have you heard of green hydrogen to replace gas, or are we going to just replace gas altogether with electricity?
The priority is to replace gas altogether with electricity. The reason being that, as I mentioned, council is procuring 100% renewable energy under a long-term contract, so that we're already receiving zero emissions from that 100% renewable energy being purchased.
Okay, any other questions from councillors? Councillor Ellison.
Through the chair, Elise, with the apparent success of FOGO out of Penrith Council, I believe, they saved $1 million or something like that in garbage removal. Did council consider FOGO at all prior to the contract being granted in 24?
Council has a number of contracts in place. So one of those is for the management and processing of garden organic materials. So that contract doesn't end until June 2027. So there is no scope for council to deliver a FOGO service because we have committed to that contract, which doesn't end until June 2027, and that's for the receival and processing of garden organics only, not inclusive of food. So that has also fed into part of the reason why we are one of those councils that will be moving towards the FOGO mandate closer towards the year 2030. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry, Councillor Lansbury.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to pick up something that Councillor Jamieson referenced about solar panels. I think it's item 39 about solar panels on council buildings. I've raised this a few times now. A few years ago, I put up a motion that we consider the installation of solar panels on all new amenities buildings, which I think most of them had already been built by that stage, but I noticed that there's like 15, which is good. And I definitely support that going forward we do it as often as we can, and a little further down it's got the list of, you know, Norm O'Neill and Hurstville Aquatic Centre would make a huge difference. Obviously it's a big outlay to retrofit, if that's the right word to use, something like that, but I think the long-term benefit of that is very valuable. And the same with the existing amenities buildings. There's a lot of sporting facilities around that would really benefit if those sorts of solar panels could be installed at some point in the future. The other comment I just wanted to make was about carbon credits. I like the approach of last resort and trying to reduce emissions rather than, I just always think that the whole carbon offset thing is a bit flaky. It just doesn't really make sense to me. It's like crypto. I don't get it. I just don't see how it works. But yeah, so thank you. That's included in the report. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
Councillor Ellison.
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with Councillor Lansbury about the carbon credits. It just seems like, why would we go down that track when we could still plant so many more trees, you know, around the place? That would be the way. Like, it's not just a matter of reducing emissions, it's actually eating the carbon dioxide up out of it. No better thing than a tree. So just a comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions?
Yeah, just on that, can we actually measure that? Like, can we actually carbon offset and measure that in our figures or not? Because it's a bit weird sort of thing.
Sorry, just if I understand the question, so are you referring to whether or not we could?
Offsetting is basically getting someone to plant trees and having recognition, but if we do that, can we have recognition of it?
To offset, so based on the carbon emissions from contained within this report, so roughly 2,800 tonnes of CO2 emissions, we would need to plant roughly 280,000 trees. That's a huge number within our limited LGA. As a reference point, we have roughly 38,000 street trees on public land so far. So to be planting an additional 280,000 trees, and that would be per year to offset any emissions as they come in future years as well. So we don't have that current available land space within the LGA to offset directly within our LGA.
Perfect. I don't expect to plant 280,000 trees, but how do we, like the trees that we have now, how does that offset? Like, do we have any measurement of offsetting it? So the more that we plant, then we should be able to offset somewhat. I would just.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid point. That would be part of a detailed probably carbon accounting process. So we'd look to get that advice as part of that independent verification and assessment of our emissions profile that's due to be completed by June 2025. So yeah, that's definitely a question that can be considered as part of that piece of work, whether or not existing trees can contribute towards offsetting carbon emissions within our LGA, existing trees. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions or comments from the councillors? In that case, I'll put this report to a vote. And go around the room, please.
Madam Mayor,
For.
Mr. Chair.
For.
Councillor Allison.
For.
Councillor Arthur.
For.
Councillor Jamieson.
For.
Councillor Lansbury.
For.
That's 6 votes for, unanimous.
Thank you. The next item is ENB 04724 T24 005 residential electronic e-waste drop-off events. And Mr. Spooner from the staff is going to address that item for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This report seeks Council's endorsement of a recommended tenderer to provide residential e-waste drop-off services at council depots. Council provides these events on a quarterly basis, and up until August this year provided them on an alternate basis between Carlton and Mortdale. I guess fortunately or unfortunately, based on the fact that this program has been very successful and has a lot of demand for its services, plus we've also added some additional materials to be collected. It was found that the Carlton depot was not suitable for that event, and in August, council resolved that we make our own call on, or the general manager make a call on which depot we use depending on which event we run. So predominantly, the Mortdale depot is the preferred depot at this stage, although we had a notice of motion at council's last meeting in relation to some concerns raised by a business in the Mortdale industrial area about some impacts as a result of an event. So we will be looking as part of that process to review the traffic management plan, which works in quite well with the new process of having a new tenderer to provide that service. So the current tender has expired. We've been going on a month-by-month basis. So council went to tender. We did a 3-week tender process through the vendor panel, seeking an expression of tender from suitably qualified tenderers for a minimum initial 3-year period plus 2 1-year additional years at council's sole discretion. We received 3 submissions. They were reviewed against the predetermined assessment criteria, which includes the 6 standard, quantitative measures, being, like event management, programming, experience, staff, WHS and environment practices, and of course the value for money being the final criteria. As a result of that, one tenderer stood out by achieving that, I guess, the highest criteria through that assessment process. The good news is that the tender price meets our current budget requirements, which means we can provide that service on a quarterly basis moving forward. Any other information would have to come from the confidential attachments to the report, but what I provide you is a broad summary which leads back to the recommendation that we're seeking council's endorsement of the tenderer provided in the confidential attachment to be authorised and to be executed by the general manager if the council sees fit. Thank you, councillors.
Thanks, Mr. Spooner. Can I get a mover and a seconder on that report, please? Councillor Allison and Councillor Lansbury, seconded. Thank you. Before we go to any discussion, can I ask if councillors have any questions on the confidential attachment at all?
No.
So no questions on the attachment. Okay, in that case, we'll go ahead with any questions or comments from the councillors.
Sorry.
Councillor Jamieson.
If I could just ask you to repeat. So, in light of the issues that were brought up, so how are we dealing with it? Like we're having extra drop-off days?
We're looking at the traffic management plan, and that may incorporate a range of issues such as signage or additional staff at certain key points. We could even be looking at changing our days, so it's not done on a Saturday, but perhaps a Sunday. So that's to be determined yet, but that's part of that process we've got to go through prior to the next event, which is due in February.
So when it says 3 to 6 months, do you say we're not increasing? It's not relevant to what's happening here at all? Or?
The report says 3 to 6 months, which I guess we can do them within. At the moment, they're quarterly. We could go and do them, instead of 4 times a year, we could do them. 3 times a year, we do them 4 times a year, depending on our budget. But that just gives us scope. If we want to do them more often, we can, based on that tender process. But at the moment, we're looking at doing them quarterly.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, thanks, councillors. In that case, I'll put this to the vote.
Madam Mayor,
For.
Mr Chair,
4.
Councillor Allison,
4.
Councillor Arthur,
4.
Councillor Jamieson,
4.
Councillor Lansbury.
4.
6 votes for, unanimous.
Thanks, councillors. there being no other items on the agenda, sorry, I've lost this one. Yeah, sorry, I declare this meeting closed at 7:30 p.m. Thank you, everybody.